Hi everyone, we're here live in Limerick Museum with these lovely people, and we're just going to have an artist talk about my exhibition. So I'm just going to put it in here, and the lovely Mairead is going to offer her technical expertise. So sound, my mic isn't working, so sound might be not so great, but hopefully you'll get to see it anyway. So thank you everyone for coming to join me. And the story of this exhibition was I was offered it a year ago by Maurice Cullinan, who's an amazing artist based in Limerick, and he has connections with the museum and he offers his exhibition space to artists. So I was very lucky. He asked me would I like to have a solo show. So you've got to take these opportunities when they come along. So I said yes. And then he said the proviso is you can't just bring in your own work. You have to find something in the museum and build a new body of work about that. So that was quite challenging. So the very first chance I had, I came up to Limerick and I came in to see the space. There was a beautiful exhibition here by Lizzie Kinsella, and she'd all look up her Instagram, these huge long installations inspired by Limerick lace, and they were fabulous. So then I wandered around the museum and I didn't really see anything that inspired me. There was lots of it's a fabulous museum and really, really interesting, worth looking at, but there's nothing I thought, oh yeah, I can make paintings about this. And the only thing I saw that was sort of interesting was, to me, were these sweet molds. And I thought the shapes were interesting, and maybe I could do something with that. So I then started researching Cleves factory and Cleves toffee, and the building is very iconic in Limerick and it's still here. And I knew nothing about it, and it's a very fascinating period in Limerick's history. There was a Limerick Soviet, so I went down a deep dive for months into Limerick history. I had phone call meetings with the curator, so I felt like I was a historian. I was writing this thesis, and then I did this for months, and then I went, hang on now, where are the paintings? Because ultimately I want to paint. I said, is there no, so I just abandoned it completely, and I went back into the digital archive. So Limerick Museum actually has the largest online digital archive of any museum in the country. It's actually one of the oldest museums, or I think it's the oldest museum in Ireland. Though even though the space here is small, and I think it's its third space. At one stage it was in where Limerick City Gallery is now. It's moved around a lot, and it doesn't have the space to show all of its archive. So the digital archive is open to the public. You can just go in. So I went in and I just started searching, and one of the words I put in was woman, because I'm interested in female stories and the female narrative. And I found these amazing photographs, and I immediately had that kind of reaction to it, that emotional connection to it. I thought, okay, there's something here. So these are the kind of photographs I found. They're old glass slides. So I saw, let's put up here for the, I do want to pass that around, Mairead. These old glass slides were scanned in. I can see the images, and there were all these women standing outside buildings, outside houses like this. And I just became really fascinated with them. So this lady here is interesting because she's posing. Most of them are standing very austere, very uncomfortable. But this lady is posing, maybe like kind of film. Her legs are out, her hands on her hip. There. And it gave an insight into life in Limerick. Like this one here is incredible. There's a bird box on top, it looks like top of her head on the building, and there's an opening for like doves. Almost like Florence in Italy or something, and apparently it was a hobby like in northern England, racing doves, and so it really, really is very, very interesting. So I immersed myself in all these photographs, and I just started painting them. I started painting initially the photograph as it was with the building. This one is fabulous because it's a greyhound, and I have a lurcher, and we can see he's living with her because his back legs are inside, his front legs are outside, and she's holding him with a little rope, and her pocket is bulging full, and she's wearing her house coat, and she looks quite stern. And I imagine he was very valuable, like he was made for racing, so he lived inside, and she was holding very tightly onto him. This is another really interesting one. So most of the cottages are quite small. This one is 2-story. And the woman is wearing a tie, and she's her hair in that kind of 20s cut, and she's holding a book. So I wonder, was a little girl, was she maybe, a school teacher or something? So she was more professional. It was really, really interesting. So I contacted the museum and I said, who took these photographs? Why were they taken? Who were the people? And what they told me, Dr. Zara Power, the curator, said, it's a big mystery. all these photographs, about 800 of them, these glass slides were found in a basement, abandoned, most of them are broken, and they have no idea, apart from they know it's Limerick, because they can recognise the buildings, like some of those houses are in the Athlunket Street area, I think it is, that they still exist, and but they don't know who took them, who the people are, nothing about it. So I asked, could I examine the original material, the glass slides, and the glass slides, they said, well, we'd have to go and find them. So in my head, the Limerick archive was like this FBI archive, with shelves and boxes, and these were scanned in the 90s, decades ago, and they may not have been seen since. So I had to identify the certain numbers that were my favourites, which were the two of these ones here, and the ones I ultimately painted. And so eventually I got to examine them. I was very excited. I came up here, they set up a desk for me, and I had to wear cotton gloves, like I felt like a real historian or something. So I opened up the glass slides, and I was surprised. They were bigger than I thought. They were about 10 centimetres high. I thought they'd be very tiny. And they were negatives. Of course they were negatives, but I just hadn't thought about it because I was looking at the scanned-in photograph. I forgot the source material was a negative. And I could hold up the light, and I could see it, and corners are broken, and they were so fragile. And one of them actually, as I held it, fell apart in my hands. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. They're like, don't worry, they're all like this. So it was really interesting to see them, and I felt quite emotional about it because I'd been painting these faces, and then to see the actual image that was photographed was really, really interesting, quite moving for me. So the source material, the negatives, then I actually started painting paintings of negatives, saying maybe I'll do a whole painting of the actual negatives, and then I kind of abandoned that because even though it was interesting, it was what I saw, it didn't make for wonderful paintings. So as I focused down, I realised what I was interested in were the people in the photograph, really the women. Most of these photographs were of women. And because there's no story, I imagined my own story. So I imagined the photographer was perhaps commissioned to photograph maybe social housing, maybe the occupants. And I imagined that he knocked on the door and said, will you stand outside for a photograph? And it's summertime because the windows are cracked open and they're wearing like short-sleeved clothes. And they just stood outside as they were, some of them very smartly dressed, a lot of them with their housecoats on, it wasn't planned. And the photograph is taken from the perspective where you see the whole building and the whole road. So if there's a front, most of them are on the street. So the photograph's on the street and there's a pathway. If there was a wall, he stood in front of the wall so you could see there was a wall. If there was 2 stories, that was taken as well. So it was really like a document of perhaps a social housing, because there was a lot of letters in the archive about the condition of social housing, so maybe somebody commissioned this. There were lots of scratches on the glass slides, little kind of letters and numbers, and I became obsessed with that for a while. I was thinking, maybe there's a code and I'm going to break this code. So I thought perhaps it was like maybe letters of street names, or maybe dates or initials, but I couldn't really make sense of it. And I imagined it was a notebook, like every photographer to take photographs, they note down the people, but the notebook never survived. So this is one of the photographs that became part of the exhibition. It's a mother and son, and I just love this image. It's this painting here. What I loved about it is how she's holding him, and his hands, and they're all kind of entwined, and his hand is around her neck, you can see it here, and his head is curved in, and it's a real, it's an image of that kind of maternal love of a young child, a toddler, and she's smiling at the camera, but there's a tension in her smile because he's crying and he's terrified. He's like, what's this strange experience? I imagine also that it was perhaps the first time they were ever photographed. So it was a very strange thing, and also because there was no flash, it was pre-flash, the photographs would have been taken with using the daylight, strong daylight, to expose the negative. So you just stand for quite a long time. So it wasn't like a quick snap. It was this is the mother and son. You have to pass that around, Mairead. So my background, I'm a self-taught artist, but I really love painting abstractly, and Trish as mostly framed for abstract pieces. And it didn't feel right to paint these abstractly because they're people. So I started painting them, drawing them and painting them. And I've never had a solo exhibition like this before, so I didn't really have a method. Like these girls now here from Limerick School of Art, they'll probably tell me I did it all wrong. I should have had my sketchbooks my plan. So the only way I could do it was I just kept drawing and painting. Almost like you draw your own portrait, you know the planes of your own face. I drew them so much that I knew their faces. And I just do them over and over again. And I'll just show you another one of the people. This is the first one I really liked. It's a mother and daughter, and I loved the angular shape of her hair and the fact that she seems to be looking off to the side. She's not looking at the camera, and there's quite a strong, it's this girl here, there's quite a strong expression. Like for a young girl, it's a very strong expression in her face, and I think the shapes were just so beautiful. Like the mother is smiling, wearing a housecoat, but she's looking off to the side, and it's just really, really interesting. The original images I saw were very low res, and I thought she was looking to the side. So I painted her like that for a long time, but when I saw the high res image, her head is turned, but her eyes are looking at the camera. This is one of the things I experimented with. Also, because the photographs were so strong, I thought maybe I'm going to try printing, maybe I'm going to try transfer techniques. So I did a workshop in the back one are the cork printmakers, and I tried with this image various printing techniques just to experiment. These are very early experiments. So I had enough time because I had a year to work with to explore all of this, and I quite liked the blurriness of the image. I liked this. I just liked her face and the expression. So I did a little exploration, but ultimately I decided, so these were all very kind of embarrassing experiments with printmaking. But I realized ultimately, I'm not a printer, I want to paint. So I narrowed down to the faces. I started with buildings, I kept going to the faces and their eyes, because in the original imagery, this is the last girl here. This is another one I love because she's standing in the doorway, and her expression, she's quite young, there's kind of a plumpness to her face, like a young girl, maybe 16, 17, but her hands show such tension. Her hands are like this, and perhaps it's the tension of having to stand still for the photograph, or perhaps it's about her life. She doesn't look very happy, she seems very vulnerable. But in the photograph, her eyes are in shadow and you can't really see her eyes. So I discovered, as I painted them, if I painted them very realistically, so these paintings here, you want to move them around here. These paintings here, their underpaintings are actually very realistic. You could actually see, and it's of that girl I just showed you, you could just see the face and the mouth and the shape, and it was very accurate. But it somehow killed the emotional reaction I had to her face when I saw her. It was lost. So I did a whole series of these paintings that were quite representational and quite figurative, and they didn't feel like me, and they didn't feel very true to what I felt when I saw these women. So then, in a spur of desperation or madness or frustration, it was kind of winter time, and I was on my own, and the early afternoon in winter where the light goes dark really early. So I had mixed my palette, and I knew roughly that's the dark colours, that's the light colours, that's my white. And I turned off the light, and I painted in the dim grey light where I couldn't see the colours anymore, but I could see the shapes. And I think this one down here at the end, this is the first one of those I did. So I had a painting underneath that, and then I just, this one down here, I blurred out all this, and so the painting, you can kind of see underneath, and I just scraped it out, and I got my brushes, and I just went very gesturally over where the faces, because that's how I saw the negative. I could see these shapes, and I turned on the light, and I thought, oh wow, I really like this. This is much more like me. I think that has certainly the first images where I thought she was to the side. For me, this captures her much more than the really tight images. So then I experimented more with that, and this is probably the next one I did here. And that's of the last girl I showed you, which I just love her face. I think she's like a Greek statue or something. So there's an underpainting, which is so I had the shape. I knew where the hair was, I knew where the eyes were, and I just blurred it out. And because I was working wet with wet, I was working with acrylics. It was quite thick amount of acrylic. But when you work wet and wet, there's an energy to the paint, and all you painters will know that. Whereas when I was working with tiny brushes, trying to get the eyes, it didn't feel like me, didn't feel right. So I thought this fast work, and some of them didn't work out, and I had to scrape off the paint and do them again. Actually, quite a lot of them. Very few worked out immediately, but this one did work out. I just thought the expression of her face, and because in the original image I can't see where her pupils are, and I can't see exactly where her eyes are, so when I was drawing them in, it felt wrong each time, whereas this one, I think, captures the emotion for me, and the kind of sadness in her eyes. So I just love the more abstract colour palette, because we were talking, like the lilac and the green. I just felt it captured the emotion of the sadness in her face. And also, because I was working with black and white photography, I had to imagine their colours, their hair, their eyes, everything. So in a way that gave me freedom to do something interesting with the colour palette. So this one here is the only one where I actually left quite figurative in terms of the eyes and the face. And I think you can kind of see it in the original image. So I decided, I did sort of think, will I just blur that out and do the same thing, but I decided to leave it because I think it's so tender, and it's also the only one where there's two people. But I did blur a bit the hands, because I just love the how their hands are connected together. So these paintings here, I think those of you following Instagram, you would have seen that I think I did a video of the green one where I blurred out the eye and I just went over it, and for me it felt very exciting and fresh. And I kept cropping in tighter and tighter to the faces. And what my big hope, I suppose, with doing this as well is that because they are real people, and because I was painting the young girls and the young boy, that perhaps somebody from Limerick would recognise them as maybe a grandmother or grandfather, or would recognise the houses. So perhaps they might recognise us from these abstract paintings. So what Maurice Quillan suggested is that I should print photographs of my favourites, and then I hung them outside the exhibition wall. I thought maybe somebody might recognise them, because there wasn't really space to hang them here. And then this one here, just behind you, very, very awkwardly. This is one where I did a charcoal drawing sketch, and then I felt the expression was quite good. It was still, I thought it got her expression. I laid it flat, and then I experimented with abstract techniques that I would have built up over the years, where I pressed things into wet paint to get shapes. And what's really interesting about this one is the security guard who was based in the museum, who sits at his desk here, recognised this lady from this painting. Isn't that amazing? So I was so proud that because I felt that really had her expression, and he said, I know who she is, and I was scared of her. So Pat Dillon, who sits here, he said, so he was a boy of about 10, and she was an old lady of about 70, and he said she had the same expression. So it's this lady here with a really strong masculine expression. So there's such an expression in her face that she looks like she's lived a life already, and she's perhaps maybe 10 or 11 or 12. So through this, we now have a name. He thinks it's Mrs. Frawley. He first saw Flanagan and said Mrs. Frawley. He gave us a number and a street name and the approximate year of her death. So he thinks she died in between 69 and 71. So now the museum are going to look at the census to see if they can track her down. So I was really excited about that. And I'm hoping there's still time of the week that maybe some of the other, we'll be able to put names to these people. Because I think it's quite sad that they never probably saw this photograph, and they would think it's so strange that I'm now painting them and they're hanging in the museum, and those houses still exist. So there's kind of circularity to it, and it would be lovely if we were able to identify them, or more people in the records. So this is the only full body figure I had. And this one, I painted it, and I worked on the body and the face, and it's the girl in the doorway. And I experimented with collage in this, so I painted first, and then I added on elements like the map there is on the archive, it's the map of the housing in that area, social housing, and then on her legs are letters in the bottom of the skirt. These letters are letters of complaint from people who lived in the areas about the abattoirs and about the rats and the smells. And then where her pocket is, I put some doors and windows, because I experimented a lot with other collage as well and techniques. So I had lots of pieces of paper I'd used over. So none of these ended up hanging, but these were all other things I worked on of the girls. And I really liked the tension in her hands. I thought that was really, really interesting. That her face was, that your hands betray. And this is the girl who was my first muse. I suppose I painted her quite a lot. But this was painted, and I painted probably Christmas time, and then I just kept looking at it and I thought, no, it's not finished. And then I had read somewhere that if you have a solo exhibition, you should have everything ready a month beforehand. So I was always working, my install date I think was originally early March, so I was working towards everything being ready by early February. And then as it turns out, I was right to be ready because the museum contacted me and said, there's a cancellation, place is empty for next week, can you install? And I was like, oh. So even though the work was ready, I hadn't, all the stuff you do at the end, like the varnishing, the painting edges, screwing in hanging mechanism, titling, I hadn't done any of that, and also getting work photographed. So it was a big spur, but in that last weekend when I did all that, I repainted that painting and this painting. So she didn't sit right with me. So I did the same thing, I blurred out her face, and I think I have a video of this on Instagram, and I just painted her over, and then I changed the dimensions. I brought her legs down. I think the original, the composition wasn't quite right, but the body, the proportions weren't right, so I brought her legs down, and then I overpainted her hands just to have the tension, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. But I just thought I'd take the risk because I had more paintings than I needed, so I thought if it doesn't work, fine, I just go for it. And then this one here, I just repainted the eyes because they weren't quite right, but it's a bit like that episode of Father Ted where he's tapping the car. You do one little thing, so I did one eye, and then the other eye was wrong, and the child's eye was wrong, so I had to do them all. And that was trickier because it's small and fine, and I was working with the brushes, which is really, I can do it, but this was more fun because I was just kind of going for it and imagining her. But I'm really glad I did it because I think it's much more energy in this piece than the original one, which was too pretty. I suppose it was too cartoon-like, it wasn't really her. And then the very last painting I finished was the one in the corner. Sorry, you can walk around. You can go this one here in the corner. So again, I painted the face. It's the same girl, and she was quite representational. And then I did the same thing where I just blurred it all out, and then I got my brush with very dry paint this time, and I just dragged her across. And again, I just thought, oh yeah, I like this. And the way I don't know if I like it or I hate it, but everybody liked it. Yes. So it kind of worked. But that was the very last one I finished. And then in the end, they are all just heads in this exhibition. I also had painted their feet, because I think when you look at their feet and their shoes, they're quite interesting. How they stood and their shoes were quite formal. And I painted, so I also painted that girl's skirt. I did all these, I saw that in a way I had all these little mini explorations of almost like different exhibitions, and then in the end I had to kind of pull it together and curate it. So I was very lucky that Morris, with most exhibitions you might have to decide what's going into the space beforehand, and I'm not very experienced with hanging or curating, so I brought up 20 paintings, and then Morris hung it for me. So it was really interesting the decisions he made. He said how you hang an exhibition is all about the space. It's not a very big room. It's a very high ceilinged, and it's a nice empty space. But he just anchored this with two. I think he pitched this one first. He started with that one, and then he just left two here and one at the end. He decided that nothing on the columns, so it had space. And then at the end, this opposite wall, one big painting, and then these two are together. The dark one with the body in the doorway, and then the one that Pat recognised because he said this is very gentle and that's very dark, so that's almost like a palette cleanser. And then we only hung one here because the table was here with the security guard, and then I had painted all these small ones, and I would love to have one of the small ones because that's more, they're more recognisable. It's more accurate. So there was one nail left here, so we just said, okay, what does it look like? and I just think they work because of the colours, and I just think the contrast worked. So that was also a very interesting experience. And then I had photographed, I realised, where do I hang the photographs I took? So I thought, okay, there's really no space here. Any grouping here would have taken away from the paintings. So we hung them just outside the door. There wasn't any passing around. So that's really the story. Are there any questions? Anything at all about painting or? Yeah?
How did you choose your colour palette?
How did I choose my colour palette? I started off painting them very realistically, like, flesh tones, like this one here. And the colours of their clothes and their hair, I could interpret myself. Like, as you can see, her hair is dark, and then the other girl's hair looked lighter, perhaps, so I just experimented with, and I when I paint, particularly I paint abstractly, I tend to have what I call hero colours, because the colour that becomes the hero, and I'm painting, I'm trying out lots of colours. I also build up a lot of layers, so sometimes at the beginning I don't know, but then one colour becomes the hero colour. So for the painting in the corner, it was that lilac and green and that contrast. I suppose because the green and blue are so strong, I wanted something much more muted in contrast. And yeah, they all had it. So the one I just finished, the blue, just made everything pop at the end when I painted the blue. So it's usually at the end I had one colour that makes it work. And I suppose I painted their faces, and then I just gave them all a different background colour, and I went for something quite pale, but I also wanted them to unify. And what was interesting is I did find, as I was working on a body of work, that they started kind of communicating with each other. And it's the first time I've really experienced that. I've heard artists talk about that. But I could see, these are the ones that are now working together as a group. And I could see I had similar colours. But I like to play with the more abstract colours, because that's more what I'm interested in. I'm primarily an abstract painter. So I suppose that I made abstract portraits. And because they were black and white, I could really play with that. So even though this one is a little bit different because it's much more representational, and I made it very soft with the colours, I deliberately left this area blank, the doorway. I did the same device in the other doorway. I didn't paint it, I just left it blank, so I think that worked. And then the other decision was whether I wanted to frame them. Initially I thought maybe I'd frame the smaller ones, and then Mara said, no, unless you're framing everything, frame nothing. So I thought, okay, I won't frame everything. And it actually does work on these walls. The paintings are kind of coming out from the wall. But a lot of the colour decisions were made as I painted, like her orange neck. Yeah, that remained from the previous painting. The previous painting was very different colour, and I just blurred out the white and then the blue, and it just worked. And then I actually added more orange to her neck because I thought the contrast. I suppose you're always thinking about complementary colours like blue and orange, or there's certain colours that work together, purple and yellow, so it makes colours pop. And then also if you've got very strong, high chroma colour, to have something that's very pale and muted, contrast will always work with paintings. It just makes the colours. But yeah, some of them they just had, and I found that some of the people had certain key colours. So some of the people were always green or blue. Her lips were always pink. I know they became like as if you're writing a novel or a book. They become characters in my head, and that's the colour she is. So I just developed my own shorthand with them.
Like their own auras.
Yeah. And she always had a lot of her. I have other paintings of her that didn't make it. They always had blue, green hair. I don't know if she seemed to be very green. She was very pale and pink and ladylike. So they had their own characters, the colours that made sense. But a lot of trial and error, and lots of ones that didn't work as well. A good question. Any other question?
Actually, a question for you. Did you, as an abstract painter, and you were talking about having their own stories and that coming to life, were you able to give them a story, or did you?
Oh, completely, yeah. That's a great question. So, did I give them their own story? Yes, I completely imagined, and because there was no story, I was free to imagine. I think when you're painting, you do go into your own narrative in your own head, and painting people that I didn't know, I gave them a story. So, like, her story is that young mother with the child, and he's quite well dressed, and there are stories to house, but she's embarrassed and he's crying. So I identified with that, as a new mother, you have that tension. And the husband is off, so I imagined where was he? He was still there, but she was working. She's quite well dressed. She's not wearing a house coat. This girl, I imagined, the girl in most of these paintings, so she's young. Initially I thought, is she the daughter of the house? But then I thought maybe she's married. Maybe she got married really young. But I thought she seemed very unhappy. I thought she seemed very stressed. And so yeah, I did imagine a whole life for her. And then the mother and the daughter, her face is so stern and she's lived such a life. So I did imagine her as being quite a tough person. So when, Pat identified her as being scared of her, I thought, wasn't it amazing how her face was set at that, whenever it happened to her at that age, that strong bone structure, quite a masculine bone structure, that her older face was still the same, the character was still there. I thought it was quite extraordinary. And what I'm curious to know now is the house in the photograph, is that the same house she ended up in? Did she inherit that house? He said to me she married, and then she married a fisherman, he said. But I don't know about the children or any of that now, so he's doing research. He was on some Facebook connecting with people, so we'll find out more. But yeah, I did imagine their lives and their stories, and I didn't give them names actually. They didn't have names, but I felt I suppose the way I connected, they all had a certain colour. They had a certain life, and I suppose I was really interested in the ones that had that vulnerability and that sadness and something going on behind, rather than the ones that were like smiling for the camera and facing out. They were more intriguing to me. Even though I painted all the ones I passed around, I painted them all, but then these ones just became more and more interesting to me, so I just decided to, because I can do what I want as myself. I just focused on these ones in the end. That's a good question. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming and for listening, and thank you on Instagram as well for listening. I hope you heard that. And we'll finish up now. Let's see if I can remember how to finish it. And how do you end it? There's a button down there.